Sex has been a fundamental part of human life for as long as we've existed, shaping cultures, religions, laws, and the very structure of society. But how has it been understood and treated throughout history? Today, we're diving into some fascinating and often surprising examples of how humanity has perceived and regulated sex throughout the ages. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest known civilizations. Here, ideas of sexuality were intertwined with spirituality. Temples dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, the deity of love and fertility, often employed sacred prostitutes. Far from being taboo, this practice was seen as a divine act, a way to honor the gods and promote fertility across the land. Sex in this context wasn't just physical, it was sacred. Fast forward to ancient Greece, and we see a society that had a complex relationship with sex. Sexuality was openly depicted in art, poetry, and even public life. However, it was far from a libertine free-for-all. For instance, while male-male relationships were accepted and even idealized, they tended to occur within strict social hierarchies, with clear roles defined by factors like age and social status. Meanwhile, women's sexuality was often tightly controlled and largely confined to the private sphere, a reflection of broader gender inequalities in Greek society. Over in ancient Rome, things took on a more pragmatic tone. For the Romans, sex was less about theology or philosophy and more about asserting power and status. Elite Roman men often flaunted their sexual exploits as a display of dominance, not just over women, but over younger men and slaves as well. However, the rise of Christianity in late antiquity ushered in a sea change. The new religion promoted chastity as a virtue and sought to regulate sexual behavior to align with its moral teachings, laying the groundwork for attitudes towards sex in medieval Europe. Speaking of medieval Europe, this was a time of stark contrasts. On one hand, the Church condemned non-marital and non-reproductive sex, tightening the moral screws on the population. On the other hand, the very existence of bawdy literature, fertility festivals, and brothels reveals that people didn't always toe the line. In fact, in certain cities, brothels were even licensed by authorities, seen as a necessary evil to channel sexual desires in a controlled environment. In non-European cultures, the story of sex unfolds quite differently. On one hand, the Church condemned non-marital and non-reproductive sex, tightening the moral screws on the population. On the other hand, the very existence of bawdy literature, fertility festivals, and brothels reveals that people didn't always toe the line. In fact, in certain cities, brothels were even licensed by authorities, seen as a necessary evil to channel sexual desires in a controlled environment. In non-European cultures, the story of sex unfolds quite differently. In India, for example, texts like the Kama Sutra didn't just celebrate sex as pleasure, but treated it as an art form, interwoven with ideas of love, relationships, and spirituality. Meanwhile, in Japan, sexuality was famously portrayed in ukiyo-e prints, showcasing candid depictions of human intimacy across classes and contexts. Across the world and throughout time, sex has been seen as everything from sacred to sinful, as a source of life or a source of scandal. Understanding how different societies approach this universal aspect of existence gives us a window not just into their values and beliefs, but also into human nature itself. Whether celebrated or controlled, seen as divine or dangerous, the history of sex reminds us of its enduring impact on culture, power, and identity. It's a mirror reflecting who we were, who we are, and who we might become.